me. I need you to hold me.
No, I won't be holding you.
On the morning of December 18th, 1997, John Farley went to check on his brother. He had a key to the apartment on the 60th floor of the John Hancock Center in Chicago, one of the most famous buildings in the city. The black tower with the X-shaped support structures that you can see from every angle of the downtown skyline, the building that defines that particular piece of the lakefront. His brother lived up there, had been living up there, paying for a view that few people in the city could afford, in the specific way that celebrities occupy spaces that communicate their distance from ordinary life. Had been up there for days, with no one hearing from him, with no one knowing what was happening inside. John let himself in. He found Chris in the apartment entryway, not in the bedroom, not on a couch, but in the entryway, the first space you enter when you come through the door, the transitional zone between the outside world and the private interior, the threshold. He was on the floor. He was wearing only pajama bottoms. He was 33 years old. He had been dead for some hours before John arrived. The coroner determined that death occurred early that morning. He had died alone in the 60th floor apartment of one of Chicago's most famous buildings, in a city that had made him and that he had loved, and nobody had known until his brother came with a key. The cause of death, confirmed by autopsy several weeks later, was a speedball, a combination of morphine and cocaine injected simultaneously. Advanced atherosclerosis, a severe buildup of arterial plaque, was listed as a significant contributing factor. He had not slept in 4 days. He weighed approximately 296 pounds. He had been to drug and alcohol rehabilitation at least 17 times. The last week of his life had been described by people who were with him during parts of it as something biblical in its excess 4 days of drinking and drugs and bars and strangers, a binge that the people who witnessed it recognized as different from his previous binges, not in kind but in finality, as if some part of him knew it was the last one. He was 33 years old, the same age as his idol, John Belushi, who had died of a speedball in room 3 of the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles 15 years earlier. The same drug combination. The same age. The same trajectory from the Chicago comedy scene to Saturday Night Live, to Hollywood films, to a death that nobody was surprised by and everyone was devastated by. There was a rosary placed in his hand at the scene. He had asked for that. He was a devout Catholic who attended Mass twice a week until the very end, who had confessed his sins and tried to change and returned to the sins and confessed again, who believed with genuine conviction that any homeless man he encountered might be Jesus and treated them accordingly. The rosary was not a gesture. It was the truth of who he was. And here is the thing about that rosary, the thing that makes the whole story more complicated than the headline version allows. He had attended Mass the Sunday before the binge that killed him. He had gone to Street, Michael's Catholic Church, and prayed as he always prayed, and then he had begun 4 days that ended exactly as everyone who knew him had been afraid they would end. The faith and the addiction existed in the same body, in the same man, for the same years. Neither one canceled the other. Both were completely real. This is the story that the headline version does not tell. The headline version says, "Comedian dies of drug overdose, same as his idol Belushi, same age, same drug." That version is accurate as far as it goes. It does not go anywhere near far enough. The full story is about a man who was more than anyone expected from any angle, funnier than the premise of his comedy suggested, more capable of serious work than his reputation indicated, more spiritually serious than his public persona allowed, more lonely than the loudness concealed, and more aware of his own fate than anyone who loved him could fully accept. This is the complete story of Chris Farley. Not just the funny parts, though the funny parts were extraordinary. Not just the addiction, though the addiction was real and severe and documented and ultimately fatal. The full story. The Irish Catholic family in Madison, Wisconsin, the father he adored and stayed fat for, the Belushi obsession that was simultaneously inspiration and prophecy, the 5 years of genius on Saturday Night Live, the films, the faith, the 17 trips to rehab, the the specific quality of loneliness inside the loudest person in any room, and the 4 days in December 1997 that ended on a linoleum floor with a rosary in his hands. Before we go further, subscribe to this channel right now. If you want stories like this, told completely and honestly, hit the button. It keeps this going. And then stay with me, because the story of Chris Farley is bigger than the punchline. February 15th, 1964, Madison, Wisconsin. Christopher Crosby Farley is born into a family that is Catholic, Irish, prosperous, and loud. His father, Thomas Farley Sr., owns an oil company and is a big man in every sense, big in body, big in personality, big in appetite, who loves his children with a completeness that coexisted in complicated ways with his own significant struggles with food and alcohol. His mother, Mary Ann, is a homemaker. There are 5 children: Tom Jr., Barbara, Chris, Kevin, and John. The family grows up in Maple Bluff, an affluent enclave on the shores of Lake Mendota, attending Catholic schools, going to Mass, operating within the specific framework of Irish Catholic Wisconsin that produces its children with certain durable qualities: loyalty, humor, the capacity for both extraordinary warmth and extraordinary stubbornness. Chris Farley was, from the beginning, a person whose need to make people laugh was not a choice or a strategy, it was a reflex. He was overweight from childhood, and overweight children in the 1970s were subject to the cruelty of peers who had not been taught to manage their instinct toward mockery. The way he managed it was to get there first. If you were going to laugh at him, he would make you laugh harder and on his own terms. The class clown who uses humor as a shield is a familiar figure, but Farley's version of it was something more. He was genuinely funny. The humor was not just a mechanism for managing threat, it was a gift. The origin story, the specific moment that pointed him toward comedy, has been told in many places, and it is consistent across all the tellings. His father took the family to see National Lampoon's Animal House when Farley was 14 years old. The film starred John Belushi as Bluto Blutarski, the anarchic, unstoppable, magnificent force of disorder who crashes through the orderly world of the Faber College establishment and cannot be contained or defeated by the forces of propriety that try to manage him. Bluto is not complicated. He is appetite and energy and the refusal to accept that the rules apply to him. He is one of the great comic performances in American film history. Thomas Farley Sr. watched Animal House and laughed until he cried. The big man in the theater, tears running down his face, destroyed by John Belushi's Bluto. His son was watching his father laugh. And the son understood, in the specific way that a 14-year-old understands something that will shape the rest of his life, exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to do that. He wanted to be the person who made his father laugh like that. He wanted to produce in the man he loved most the specific, overwhelming joy that Belushi had just produced. That was the goal. Everything that followed was an attempt to reach it. He said this directly in multiple interviews across his career. The only person I was ever trying to make laugh was my dad. He meant it without irony or false modesty. It was the truest thing he said about himself. His father was his primary audience before SNL existed, before Second City, before any of it. The specific quality of his father's approval, the big man collapsing with laughter, seeing his son do the thing was the thing he was building toward. It was also the thing that made the staying fat make sense, and the thing that made stopping the addiction nearly impossible, because the father who loved him so completely could not fully see the harm. He attended Edgewood High School of the Sacred Heart in Madison, playing football, developing the physicality that would later define his comedy. His football coach remembers him as surprisingly capable, athletic, in ways that his size made people not anticipate. He could bench press 225 pounds. He was beneath the comedy and the bulk, a genuine athlete with genuine coordination and surprising agility. The comedy he eventually developed played on the contrast between the expected awkwardness and the actual physical capability. and that contrast worked because the capability was real. He studied theater and communications at Marquette University in Milwaukee, a Jesuit Catholic university. The theater training he needed and the Catholic intellectual tradition he was already steeped in occupied the same campus. The Jesuits are known for an approach to education that takes both the intellectual and the spiritual seriously without treating them as separate domains, and Farley thrived in that environment in the specific way of someone who had always understood that the funny and the serious were not opposites but complements. He was a devoted Catholic for his entire life, attending Mass twice a week at minimum, more often when he could, going to confession regularly with the genuine intention of change, not as a formality, but as a real attempt to address what he knew he was doing and to ask for help with it. Father Matt Foley, who became the inspiration for Farley's most famous SNL character, was a friend from these years at Marquette and in Chicago. A man who went to seminary while Farley went into comedy, who remained close to him across the subsequent years, who played basketball with him and talked about faith with him and visited him in the difficult final years. There's the public persona, and then there's the person you know as a family member and a friend. Father Foley has said Chris was that character people think he was, but he was not that character all the time. He also had a reflective side, a spiritual side, and a very caring side. He volunteered at children's hospitals without cameras or publicity. He believed, and this is documented in multiple sources, not invented retrospectively, that any homeless man he encountered could be Jesus in disguise. He made a point of treating every homeless person with specific kindness and respect. He was not performing this. He believed it as an article of faith drawn directly from his Catholic formation, from the specific teaching of the Beatitudes, from the tradition that sees Christ in the most marginalized. He was not a celebrity performing charity for the cameras. He was a man doing what his faith required when nobody was watching. The same faith that produced this kindness also produced guilt on a scale that the people around him could observe. The Catholic cycle of sin and confession and penance and sin, the specific torment of someone who knows what they are doing is wrong and does it anyway, and knows it is wrong and does it anyway, was a significant part of Farley's internal experience. He cared deeply about his choices. He felt the weight of them. He confessed them repeatedly with genuine contrition, and he could not stop making them. The addiction and the faith coexisted in him, without one resolving the other, and this coexistence was one of the sources of his suffering. After Marquette, Farley went to Chicago. He performed at the Arc Improv Theater and the Improv Olympic, where he was mentored by Del Close, the legendary acting teacher and theorist of improvisation who had also taught John Belushi. Close had developed a specific approach to improv called Herald, a long-form structure that required performers to trust each other completely and to follow the work wherever it led. He was demanding and brilliant and recognized talent with the specific clarity of someone who had been working in this world for decades. He saw Farley perform and understood what he was looking at. He joined Second City on the same day that Stephen Colbert joined. Two people who would go on to define two different aspects of American comedy, beginning their professional lives at the same institution on the same day. His Second City colleagues watched him perform and understood immediately this man was going to be famous. The only question was what kind of famous. Lorne Michaels came to see Second City in 1990. He saw Farley. The specific quality that Michaels had spent his entire career at SNL looking for the thing that separated the performers who could do what Saturday Night Live required from the performers who could not was immediately apparent. He offered Farley a spot on the show. SNL in 1990 was in a rebuilding period after a difficult stretch in the late 1980s, and the cast additions that year became one of the most talented groups in the show's entire history. Chris Farley, Adam Sandler, David Spade, Chris Rock, Rob Schneider, Tim Meadows, a collection of performers that would define American television comedy for the first half of the decade. Michaels later said of the group that if John Belushi and Danny Aykroyd had had a child, it would have been Chris Farley. He understood immediately what he had. From the moment Farley arrived on Studio 8H, he was something different from everyone around him. The cast he had joined was extraordinarily talented. He was extraordinary among the extraordinarily talented. The producers noticed. The writers noticed. The other cast members noticed. They were watching someone operate at a level that made the already high baseline of the show feel insufficient for what he could do. He was also, from essentially the moment of his arrival, starting to use drugs and alcohol with the specific intensity that the next 7 years would confirm was not a phase or an experiment, but a settled and serious addiction. The pressure of sudden fame in a demanding, high-visibility live format, combined with the culture of excess that had always surrounded SNL, and combined with the pre-existing vulnerabilities he had brought with him from Madison and Marquette, it all accelerated quickly. He was, as people who were around him at the time have said, a very sweet guy before midnight. After midnight was different. His physicality was the most obvious thing, the size, the energy, the willingness to throw his body at a piece of furniture or a wall or a floor with a completeness that made the audience laugh and wince simultaneously. But the physical comedy was not the whole picture. His timing was perfect. His instinct for character was acute. His ability to escalate a scene past the point where any other performer would stop and then push it one more time was the quality that distinguished him. The New Yorker called him the greatest physical comedian of his generation, a manic cannonball who could appear surprisingly athletic one moment and perilously ungainly the next, as likely to pull off a nifty cartwheel as he was to obliterate a piece of furniture. Accurate but incomplete. He was also a performer with genuine emotional range. Matt Foley, the motivational speaker who lived in a van down by the river, is funny because the physical comedy is impeccable, but also because the underlying sadness is real. The man who is so clearly failing at his own life while insisting others succeed, Farley understood that character from the inside. He did not play him, he recognized him. The Chippendales sketch with Patrick Swayze is one of the most remembered pieces in SNL history. Swayze, physically perfect and a genuine trained dancer, and Farley, large and apparently ungainly, both audition for the same Chippendales exotic dancer position. The joke on paper is obvious. Contrast the beautiful man with the decidedly non-beautiful man. What Farley did with it transcended the obvious joke entirely. He performed a man dancing with complete confidence and joy, not a man failing to compete with a beautiful person, not a man aware of the absurdity of his situation, but a man certain of his own worth and genuinely having the time of his life. The audience was laughing with him, not at him. Swayze, who took the sketch seriously and prepared for it carefully, later said it was one of the best performance experiences he had ever had. Farley made it that. This is the distinction that separates great physical comedy from cheap physical comedy. The great version requires the performer to believe in the character while the audience sees the joke from outside. Farley believed. He always believed. The characters he played were not winking at the audience. They were fully inhabiting their situation with the conviction that their situation was reasonable. That conviction is what made the characters funny and also what made them human. The Chris Farley show, the fan interviewer so starstruck he could barely form coherent questions, who would then smack his forehead and scream stupid, stupid, stupid at himself for asking something mortifying, was a version of something Farley felt in his own life. The terror of not being good enough. The specific vulnerability of someone who has convinced himself that the room he is in is better than he is and that his presence in it is an anomaly to be explained. When he played this character opposite Paul McCartney in a 1993 sketch asking the most famous living Beatle, "Remember when you were with the Beatles?" and then cascading into self-recrimination, the comedy was perfect and the truth underneath it was exact. He was not just playing someone who felt inadequate in the presence of greatness, he was expressing, through the vehicle of a sketch comedy character, something he actually felt. His Bill Swirsky's superfan's character, the Chicago sports fan who screamed about Da Bears, with the specific religious fervor of someone for whom the local football team is the organizing principle of the universe, was a tribute to and an affectionate mockery of the specific kind of Chicago identity that Farley himself embodied. He was from Wisconsin, not Chicago, but the working-class Midwestern Catholic sensibility that the superfan sketches captured was deeply familiar to him. He was performing his own people with a love that could also laugh at itself. And Matt Foley, the motivational speaker who lived in a van down by the river, who lectured teenagers about life choices while clearly unable to manage his own, who insisted with increasing desperation that everyone else should succeed while his own situation deteriorated in real time. The character is funny because the physical comedy is exceptional, the specific way Farley inhabited the physicality of a man whose body is barely containing his urgency. It is also sad in a specific way that the best comedy is sad. The man telling you how to live is the man who most needs to hear what he is saying. Matt Foley is a man who knows the truth and cannot apply it to himself. Farley played that character with such precision because he understood it completely. Lorne Michaels said when Farley arrived, "If John Belushi and Danny Aykroyd had had a child, it would have been Chris." The Belushi comparison was inescapable and eventually lethal. Farley had idolized Belushi since Animal House. He had been trained at Second City by Del Close, who had trained Belushi. He was now at SNL, where Belushi had launched his career. The parallel was apparent to everyone who knew both stories, including Farley. The problem with the parallel was that it included everything the genius and the excess and the death as a package, as if the chaos was not incidental to the talent but essential to it. This is a specific and dangerous mythology about comedy. The idea that the destructive excess is the source of the gift, that you cannot have one without the other, that the man who goes all the way in performance must go all the way in his private life or else the performance is somehow less authentic. Belushi had lived inside this mythology and died at 33. Farley heard the story of Belushi's life and extracted from it, consciously or not, a kind of permission, a template, a path. Jim Belushi, John's brother, tried to warn him directly. He said, "You gotta stop chasing him, Chris. He's gone. He's gone. You can't follow John. The guy did drugs. He's dead. You can't follow him with the drugs to find out who he was." He said this directly, explicitly, as someone who had watched his own brother go down this path and had been unable to stop it. Farley heard it. He understood it. He said in interviews that he understood it. He could not translate the understanding into changed behavior. He said explicitly, in his own words, "I thought that this is what you have to do to be cool, but all that shit does is kill someone. It is a demon that must be snuffed out. It is the end." He said this on record. He was describing his own situation, with complete clarity and self-awareness. He was not blind to where he was. He was blind to how to get somewhere else. His real idol, as his brother Tom clarified in the biography The Chris Farley Show, was not actually Belushi, but Jackie Gleason, the enormous, exuberant, physically expressive, genuinely vulnerable performer of The Honeymooners and The Hustler, a man whose comedy was rooted in the pathos of someone who wanted more than he had and kept reaching for it anyway. Gleason played characters who were failed by life but who refused to accept the failure as the final word. That was Farley's comedy. That was Farley's life. He was not the anarchic destroyer that Belushi embodied. He was the lovable failure who kept trying. The comparison to Belushi was the comparison that Hollywood and the press were comfortable making. The comparison to Gleason was the accurate one. It was just less quotable. By the early 1990s, the addiction was established and active. He was drinking heavily and using cocaine with the specific intensity of someone whose social world had been organized around excess since his earliest professional days. He was, as people who were around him in those years have described, a very sweet guy before midnight. What happened after midnight was a different version of the same person, one that the sweetness of the daytime person made more shocking to witness. 17 trips to rehabilitation between 1,993 and 1,997. When you see that number 17, the first instinct might be to read it as a failure of will or a failure of commitment. It is neither. It is evidence of a disease that is not responsive to ordinary willpower, that requires more than repeated, genuine attempts to overcome. Farley had genuine attempts. He had willpower. He had faith. He had community. He had a support system that included his family, his professional colleagues at SNL who genuinely cared about him, an AA sponsor in Tom Arnold, and a priest friend in Father Matt Foley. He had everything that anyone has available when they are trying to recover from addiction. And 17 times, after leaving a rehabilitation facility with genuine intentions, he went back. His AA sponsor was Tom Arnold, the comedian and actor whom Farley had impersonated on SNL, with whom he had developed a genuine friendship that extended into the serious work of sobriety. Arnold was at his side for multiple rehab attempts. He gave the eulogy at Farley's private funeral. The relationship between the man who did the impression and the man whose impression he did, sustained through years of shared work on recovery, is one of the less reported human details of Farley's life. Lorne Michaels, who had also been present for Belushi's decline and death, suspended Farley from SNL multiple times because of his drug and alcohol use. He said, later, that he had been through it with John and was not doing it again, meaning he was not going to watch someone he cared about destroy themselves without at least attempting to create consequences for the behavior. The suspensions did not ultimately change the direction. They were the response available to an employer. They were not the response the disease required. The addiction produced a loneliness that Farley spoke about directly in a Rolling Stone interview that has been widely quoted in the years since his death. This notion of love is something that would be a wonderful thing. I don't think I've ever experienced it, other than the love of my family. At this point, it's something beyond my grasp. But I can imagine it, and longing for it makes me sad. The man that everyone who knew him describes with specific, unwavering warmth, the most likable person in any room believed he was unlovable. He performed connection for a living and was unable to find it in his private life. He was the loudest person in every room, and he was alone in the ways that mattered most. His father is a significant part of this picture, and the biography written by his brother Tom and Tanner Colby addresses it with honesty that few family biographies manage. Thomas Farley Sr. was a big man physically, in personality, in appetite, whose own food and alcohol dependencies mirrored his son's in ways that neither of them fully acknowledged while both were alive. The family dynamic was loving and also enabling in the specific way that enabling works. Through the love, not despite it. Chris often told friends that he stayed overweight partly to please his father, that his size was a form of connection to the man he loved most, evidence of their similarity, a way of remaining close to a person who was also large and who seemed to love him more completely than the world sometimes did. There is something specific and heartbreaking about a man who chooses to maintain the physical condition that is helping to kill him as an act of love for his father. Tom Farley Sr. provided his high school-age children beer money. He then did not acknowledge his role in fostering their relationship with alcohol. He could not see the negativity in Chris because to do so would have required seeing it in himself. He was a man who loved his son completely and whose complete love did not include the specific kind of honesty that might have helped. The biography says it plainly. When it came to Chris, his father was the definition of unconditional love, which meant, in practice, that he could not do the thing that unconditional love sometimes requires, which is to tell the truth about what you see. At his son's funeral, Thomas Farley Sr., who by then weighed approximately 600 pounds, could barely rise from his chair to embrace the casket. He died 2 years after his son. In 1999, they were buried at the same cemetery in Madison. Farley left SNL in 1995 along with Adam Sandler and others. He went to Hollywood with Lorne Michaels' genuine goodwill, with David Spade as his creative partner, and with the belief that his specific brand of physical comedy could sustain a film career. Tommy Boy, 1,995. Black Sheep, 1,996, both with Spade, both directed by Peter Sagal. Both earned approximately $32 million against modest budgets and became genuine cult classics that have continued to find new audiences decades after their release. Tommy Boy, in particular, is a film that transcends its commercial premise. It is about a large, apparently incompetent, deeply lovable man who has to save his father's business after his father dies, who has to prove himself in a world that has already decided he cannot be proven, The specific emotional arc of the film mirrors the specific emotional arc of Farley's own life. The man everyone underestimates, who loves his father more than anyone knows, who keeps trying past the point of embarrassment, who turns out to be capable of more than the surface suggested. The film also contains the moment that, for many people who watched it when they were young, is one of the most unexpectedly emotional scenes in a comedy from the 1990s. Farley's Tommy Callahan, at the end, having succeeded against all expectation, breaking down in grief for his father while a crowd celebrates around him, Farley played it straight. No jokes. The grief was real, and the audience felt it. Director Peter Segal said years later, "I thought he could win an Oscar one day. I know people might think I'm crazy saying that looking at his brief career, but I really believed in his talent." The funny version of Chris Farley was so completely the public persona that the serious version was almost invisible. But it was there. It had always been there. The same person who would hurl himself into a table for a laugh was capable, when the material required it, of sitting still and being devastated. That is the rarest combination in comedy. Beverly Hills Ninja, 1,997. He was commanding $5 million per film. He was one of the biggest comedy stars in Hollywood, on the same career trajectory as the most bankable performers in the industry. At the time of his death, the professional part of his life looked like a success story without significant complications. The complications were all inside. They always had been. He was also visibly deteriorating. At an appearance on the Nickelodeon show All That in 1997, Kenan Thompson noticed Farley struggling to perform his usual physical comedy, wheezing, laboring, unable to sustain the energy that had always seemed inexhaustible. His former SNL colleagues were watching in real time as the capacity diminished. His only SNL hosting appearance, on October 25th, 1997, 2 months before his death, was, by most accounts of the people who were there, a difficult experience. He had injured his voice during the week of rehearsals and was audibly hoarse for the live broadcast. His stamina, which had always seemed inexhaustible in his years as a cast member, was visibly compromised. He was sweating heavily. The audience and the cast could see that something was wrong. The cold open was meta in a way that, looking back, is almost unbearable. Tim Meadows and Chevy Chase try to convince Lorne Michaels that Farley is sober enough to host. The sketch is commenting directly on the situation that actually exists. The audience was laughing at something that was not, in the most important sense, a joke. Farley was performing a bit about his decline while declining. The episode was not a disaster. He got through it. The sketches existed. The audience responded. But the people who were watching who knew him could see the distance between who he was and who he had been. The episode was later partly cut in reruns. The cold open and the monologue were removed. The network had a version of his final SNL appearance that did not include the most visible evidence of what was happening to him. Chevy Chase, who had tried to intervene at Aspen and other points, had told him directly, using the Belushi comparison that everyone made about Farley against itself. "Look, you're not John Belushi, and when you overdose or kill yourself, you will not have the same acclaim that John did. You don't have the record of accomplishment that he had. It was brutal, and it was intended to shock. It was accurate. It was heard and not heeded." 2 months after the SNL appearance, John Farley came to check on his brother. At a Planet Hollywood opening in Indianapolis in July 1997, a friend saw him clearly under the influence and suggested he slow down. Farley grinned and said, "I want to live fast and die young." He delivered this line with the specific quality of a man performing a character, the reckless rock star persona, the Belushi mythology, the chosen identity. His brother Kevin and his friend Jillian Seeley were there and spent hours trying to get him out of the venue. The next morning, Farley called Jillian from his hotel room and apologized for the previous night. He knew. He was always aware, in the aftermath, of what had happened. The knowing came the morning after, when it was too late to be useful. At the U.S. Comedy Arts Festival in Aspen in March 1997, Something happened that his biographers describe as one of the most concentrated demonstrations of how visible his decline had become to the people closest to him. He was at the festival with Spade, Chevy Chase, Conan O'Brien, Bob Odenkirk, and his brothers John and Kevin. He was visibly impaired on the plane. He began drinking and using cocaine upon arrival. Spade had to prevent him from attending a formal dinner with Lorne Michaels, Dan Aykroyd, and Steve Martin, not because Farley did not want to go, but because his condition made the appearance impossible. Chase cornered him separately and made his intervention, using the Belushi comparison that was always hanging in the air around Farley and deploying it as a warning rather than an honor. What Chase told him was true, and it was brutal, and it was intended to reach the part of Farley that was still reachable. None of it changed the direction. A former drug counselor named Dallas Taylor, who had last seen Farley in August 1997 when he was kicked out of a Malibu rehabilitation clinic for disruptive behavior, said afterward, "Chris thought he needed to be loaded to be funny." This is the specific trap of the Belushi mythology as Farley had internalized it. The belief that the excess was necessary, that the authentic performance required the authentic disorder, that sobriety would cost him the thing his entire life had been built around. The belief was false, but it was held with the conviction of someone who had organized his entire identity around it. The Sunday before he died, December 14th, 1997, Chris Farley attended evening mass at St. Michael's Catholic Church in Chicago. He prayed as he always prayed, in the specific manner of someone who takes the prayer seriously rather than performing it. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him well, genuinely present in his faith even when everything else was in chaos. And then he left the church, and he began the 4 days. The binge began at a club called Karma, where he was seen in the early hours of Monday morning drinking heavily. Back at his apartment, he freebased cocaine until 9 in the morning. He attended a holiday party Monday night, then went club hopping through downtown Chicago. He ran into Dennis Rodman at some point during this, and Rodman, observing someone who was clearly in serious distress, had one of his bodyguards help Farley get home safely. He was simultaneously a celebrity surrounded by other celebrities and a man in acute crisis who could barely make it home without help. Tuesday, December 16th, he hired an exotic dancer to come to his apartment. She later gave an account of what she observed: Farley using drugs, Farley collapsing. She said he was still alive when she left. She left. He was alone again. Wednesday, Thursday, his body had not slept in 4 days. The John Hancock Center apartment, the apartment he had moved into when his career required a Chicago base, was becoming the place where the binge was ending. On December 18th, John Farley came. He had a key. He had not heard from his brother. He came to check. He found him. When the police arrived, they placed a rosary in his hands at the request of the people who loved him. The rosary was not a gesture or a ritual performed for comfort. It was the correct thing to do for a man who had attended Mass twice a week for his entire adult life, who had gone to confession regularly, who had prayed the Sunday before he died. The faith was real even when he could not live up to it, especially when he could not live up to it. The faith is most real when it is most tested, and it had been tested every day for years. Before his death, he had recorded approximately 95% of the dialogue for the lead character in a DreamWorks animated film called Shrek and Ogre, large and crude and funny on the surface, misunderstood by the world around him, living in isolation because the world had decided what he was before getting to know him, who turned out to be genuinely decent and lovable once someone took the time to look past the surface. The character fit Chris Farley in ways that were almost too perfect. He was the obvious voice. He was, in every important sense, already the character. After his death in December 1997, the filmmakers faced a decision. They had almost everything. The animation could proceed. The voice work was 95% complete. But they decided that proceeding without him would be wrong, that using the recordings he had made would feel exploitative rather than honorific, that the film should either be made with him or remade without him. They chose to remake it. The role went to Mike Myers, who created a Scottish accented version of the character. The film was released in 2001 and became one of the most successful animated films in history. In 2015, DreamWorks released the storyboards and audio recordings from Farley's version publicly. People who have heard them describe a voice that is unmistakably warm and funny, and specifically him gentler than Myers' version, more overtly sweet, the voice of someone who understood from the inside what it meant to be the large, funny figure who the world had decided to dismiss. His Shrek would have been different from Myers' Shrek, not better or worse, different, and the world never got to hear it. He was also set to appear in a third Ghostbusters film. He had other projects in development. The list of what was planned is also the list of what was lost. 500 people attended his funeral at Our Lady Queen of Peace Catholic Church in Madison on December 23rd, 5 days after his death. 3 days after Christmas would have been Adam Sandler, Chris Rock, Lorne Michaels, Dan Aykroyd, who wore a leather jacket over his suit, the same way he had dressed for John Belushi's funeral 15 years before. The echo was deliberate. John Goodman, Tom Arnold, Rob Schneider, George Wendt were there. Tom Arnold gave the eulogy a man who had impersonated him, whom he had impersonated back, who had been his AA sponsor through multiple attempts at recovery. The funeral program contained the Serenity Prayer from AA and the Clown's Prayer. David Spade was not there. He and Farley had been perhaps the defining creative partnership of the SNL years. Farley, the explosive physical presence, Spade, the dry, cutting verbal foil, their dynamic producing something that was greater than either of them separately. They had made Tommy Boy and Black Sheep together, they had been friends for years, and Spade could not go to the funeral. He has explained this in interviews over the years, without defensiveness and without making it smaller than it is. I think about him all the time. We had such a good time for so long, and we were crammed together for so long that we did have our squabbles, but I think people misunderstood me not going to the funeral. It was nothing about that. It was just too emotional, and I wouldn't be able to handle it. He was right that he would not have been able to handle it. He has been handling the loss for almost 30 years since, in his own way and on his own terms. Adam Sandler wrote a song. The Chris Farley song exists in multiple versions, having been performed in numerous venues over the decades. The version he performed on his Netflix special 100% Fresh in 2018 is devastating. The version he performed when he hosted SNL in 2019 on the stage where they had both worked, in the building where they had both become famous, in front of an audience that included people who had known Farley and people who had only known him through the sketches, is one of the most emotionally overwhelming pieces of tribute in recent television history. He starts it as a comedy song. By the end, he is crying. The audience is crying. The cameras are still running. That is what happens when you try to be funny about someone you loved who is gone. You can be funny for a while, and then you can't. He was posthumously awarded the 2,289th star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame on August 26, 2005. Spade was there, Sandler was there, Rock was there. The people who had been his people when he was alive were at the ceremony. None of them had been able to make enough of a difference in time. That is the specific grief of watching someone with an addiction. You love them, you try, and the trying is not enough, and then they are gone. And the trying continues in the form of songs and ceremonies in the specific way that people carry the people they have lost. What was Chris Farley? He was the greatest physical comedian of his generation, the New Yorker's designation holds up over time. He was a man of genuine faith who maintained his religious practice through everything: the fame, the addiction, the cycles of rehabilitation, the binges. He attended Mass twice a week until the Sunday before the binge that killed him. He confessed his sins, and he meant it, and he went back to the sins, and he confessed again. The faith was not a prop. It was the thing he was trying to live up to and repeatedly failing to, and the gap between the faith and the behavior was one of the most significant sources of his suffering. He was someone who loved his father with a completeness that was simultaneously the source of his gifts and one of the roots of his damage. He was a person who longed for romantic love and could not find it, and spoke about its absence with a directness that is difficult to read now without feeling what he was describing. The man who could make an audience of millions feel connected to him could not connect in his own private life in the way he needed. He was someone who knew exactly where he was headed. He said so. He said the drug is a demon that must be snuffed out. It is the end. He said it, and he meant it, and he could not stop. The disease was stronger than the knowing. It is always stronger than the knowing, which is why knowing is not sufficient, and why the 17 trips to rehabilitation, each of which ended with his genuine intention to stop, were not sufficient either. Peter Segal, who directed Tommy Boy and Black Sheep, has said, "I thought he could win an Oscar one day. I know people might think I'm crazy saying that, looking at his brief career, but I really believed in his talent." The director who watched him closely across 2 films believed he had more in him than the films they made together had shown. David Spade has lived with the loss for almost 30 years now. Adam Sandler writes songs. Chris Rock mentions him in interviews with the specific care of someone who is still processing a loss that is not fully resolved. Lorne Michaels has said that he lost him the same way he lost Belushi, and that he still thinks about both of them. Father Matt Foley, the real one, the priest whose name became the character, the man who played basketball with Farley and talked about faith with him and visited him in his final years, said in the documentary, "I am Chris Farley. He died alone on a linoleum floor." He did. He died alone on a linoleum floor in his pajama bottoms in a 60th floor apartment in Chicago, and a rosary was placed in his hands by people who knew that was what he would have wanted, and 500 people came to a Catholic church in Madison on December 23rd, 1997, to say goodbye. Adam Sandler performed the tribute song on SNL in 2019 when he hosted the show. He started it as a comedy song, and by the end he was crying, and so was the audience, and so was everyone watching at home. That is what happens when you try to be funny about someone you loved who is gone. You can be funny for a while, and then you can't. His name was Christopher Crosby Farley. He was born February 15th, 1964. He died December 18th, 1997. He was 33 years old, the same age as Belushi. He died of the same drug combination as Belushi. He had grown up in the specific way that made this outcome feel, in retrospect, inevitable, though it was never inevitable, because at any point in the preceding years, a different choice or a different intervention or a different set of circumstances might have changed the direction. It was not inevitable. It happened anyway. There is one more detail that belongs in this story, and it is the detail that, more than any other, reveals what the public perception of Chris Farley consistently missed. Dallas Taylor, his drug counselor, said after his death, "Chris thought he needed to be loaded to be funny. This belief that the chaos was the source of the gift, that sobriety would cost him the talent, was false. It was demonstrably false. The funniest and most technically accomplished work he ever did was his SNL work from the early 1990s, performed at a point in his career before the addiction had fully taken hold and when his physical and mental capacity was at its fullest. The later work, done in the years of deepening addiction, is not more brilliant. It is less consistent. The belief that the drug was the source of the comedy was the belief that killed him." He was also, in the years before his death, beginning to ask questions about what he wanted his career to be. The interview in Rolling Stone, in which he spoke about loneliness and love, also contained this: "Although I love this kind of comedy, sometimes I feel trapped by always having to be the most outrageous guy in the room." He was 33 years old and beginning to feel the limits of the persona he had built. He was the guy who fell through tables and launched himself off of furniture and threw his body at the world with total commitment, and it was brilliant, and he was beginning to wonder if there was something else he wanted to do. There was not time to find out. The documentary about his life, I Am Chris Farley, released in 2015, includes interviews with his family, his colleagues, and his friends. It was followed by another documentary, Chris Farley, Anything for a Laugh, in 2019. Together, they are an attempt to do what this documentary is attempting, to tell the full story, not just the spectacular part, not just the death, but the whole person. Father Matt Foley, the real one, appears in the 2015 documentary and says he died alone on a linoleum floor. That sentence carries the whole weight of what was lost. The most communal person, the person whose entire existence was organized around making other people laugh, around being with people, around the specific joy of the shared laugh, died alone. The funny part was real. The faith was real. The loneliness was real. The gift was extraordinary. The disease was stronger. The world is less funny without him in it. The world is also less kind. He was kinder than most people knew in the private ways that do not make the obituary. The hospital visits, the homeless men he treated with respect, the rosary he asked for at the end. His name was Chris Farley. The only person he was ever trying to make laugh was his dad. He made his dad laugh. He made tens of millions of people laugh. He fell through tables and threw himself at walls and channeled something enormous and joyful and human through a body that the world had decided was a punchline and made it into a gift. He did this while attending Mass twice a week and visiting children in hospitals without cameras and treating homeless men with kindness because they might be Jesus and confessing his sins and trying 17 times to stop. He was born February 15th, 1964, in Madison, Wisconsin. He died December 18th, 1997, in Chicago, Illinois. He was 33 years old. There was a rosary in his hands and 500 people at the Catholic Church and Adam Sandler crying on a stage 22 years later, still not done grieving. The world is less funny without him. That is true. It is also less kind, less faithful, and less willing to throw itself completely into things, because that was also who he was, and we did not always notice it when he was alive. Subscribe to this channel right now if this story meant something to you. Hit the button. It is the only thing that keeps this work going. And come back, because there are more stories like this. More lives that were more than the headline. More people who deserved the full telling. More gifts that the disease took before the world had finished receiving them. Chris Farley's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame is at 6366 Hollywood Boulevard, in front of what was once the I.O. West Comedy Theater, an improv venue, a place of the specific art form he had devoted his life to mastering. The star is in the right place. He earned it doing what he loved, for audiences who loved him back, in the specific idiom of physical comedy that he elevated to something that nobody before him had quite managed and nobody since has quite replicated. He was the greatest physical comedian of his generation. He was also a man who went to Mass, who visited hospitals, who tried 17 times to get sober, who believed that any homeless man could be Jesus. The star is for the comedy, the rest is for the full story. And the full story is the one that deserves to be told. He was Christopher Crosby Farley, born February 15th, 1964. Died December 18th, 1997. He made his father laugh, and then he made everyone else laugh too, and the world still hasn't found anyone who does what he did the way that he did it.